instead of an increasing number of poor people being characteristic in the population of the capitalistic society, what seems to be happening is the numbers of people who are living in poverty is smaller. Right? People are acquiring bigger houses, they're acquiring access to entertainment, they're acquiring more modes of transportation, their clothes are better, they're living longer, right, and so forth. This is not necessary to say that by the 1900s the problem of poverty has been solved, but poverty by the time we get to the 1900s is not as bad as poverty in the 1850s, and it's not as bad as poverty was in 1800. Living in poverty, but also just the raw numbers, or even as a percentage of the population, the percentage is going down, and that's a problem in that it's going in the opposite direction. In the case of the middle class is not being squeezed out. Instead, what happens is significantly the number of people who are living in the middle class is going up dramatically. People who were formerly in the poor class are rising to the middle class, and even what counts as middle class, that's a rising standard of living as the decades go on as well. And then when we start to look at the numbers of people who are rich by whatever standard of rich we want to use, we find also that the number of rich people in England, in France, in parts of Germany, and certainly in the United States and so forth, that is also going up, and again, it's going up dramatically. Now this then is problematic, because if we take Marxism as a realist account, right, of the way the world works, as a scientific account of the way the world works, and we're willing to put it to the empirical test based on the data, then these kinds of results are devastating for the classical Marxist model, because what we have then is three fairly definite predictions, and all three of those predictions turn out to be false. So what we have is, as the 1900s go on, the Marxists, when they're looking at how actual Western capitalist or semi-capitalist countries are working out, it seems like the model is not going in the direction, or the actual results are not going in the direction the model predicted, and that causes an intellectual crisis at least. What's wrong with the model? Why isn't history conforming to the theoretical model? Do we need to adjust the model? Did we miss something significant, right, and so forth. So what we have then is, by this part of the scenario, I'll just put a broad thing, we have a rethinking, right, that's going on, and here's the question is going to be, why is capitalism not developing along Marxist lines? And that's going to then take some thinking for people who are attracted to the Marxist way of thinking at this point here. Now, at the same time, if we look at the other side of the political spectrum, the Marxists are anti-capitalist, but they are also pro-socialist, and they are then inspired by the time we get into the second and third decade of the 20th century by the fact that there's a revolution in Marx's name in the Soviet Union, right? Tsarist Russia is transformed into communist Russia, and then as the decades go on, the same thing occurs in China and in other parts of Southeast Asia. There are nascent communist movements that are becoming significantly powerful as well. And so what we can then do is, while we're, as Marxists, if we're disappointed at the developments within capitalism, we can nonetheless be inspired by the developments of various socialist revolutions in other parts of the world here. Now, the problem is that by the time we get to 1950 as well, that particular way of thinking about things is also dealt some problematic blows. If we, for example, go to 1956, which is a significant year for the development of Marxism, a couple of things happened in 1956. One thing that happened was that the then premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, made a semi-secret speech announcing semi-publicly that all of the allegations about the horrors of extermination and genocide in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin were in fact true. Now, this is extraordinarily problematic because obviously from much of this time period and so on, we had people in the Western nations, the United States and England and so forth, arguing that things were very bad in the Soviet Union economically, but also in terms of its record on human rights. There were any number of dissidents who had been killed, tortured, the existence of concentration camps of sorts in Siberia was well known, but a lot of that could be dismissed as simply Western propaganda, as capitalist propaganda, trying to besmirch the good name of communism, which from the Marxist perspective has to be a system that cares about its people as opposed to the capitalist system, which is exploitative. So to have the flagship nation, right, for communism, the Soviet Union, and to have the leader of that nation announce that that nation was guilty of crimes against humanity, exterminating tens of millions of its own people, that is a devastating blow for people who believe in the rightness and justice of the Marxist cause and so forth. Also in 1956, there was televised again on worldwide television. Television is the new medium of the time, and the fact that the images could now be broadcast around the world relatively easy meant that some of the internal practices that the Soviet Union had been engaging in, there was actually visual evidence for this. It wasn't simply a matter of secondhand reports. Now, after World War II, much of Europe is partitioned between a West and an Eastern Europe. The West is open to the Allies, England, France, America, and so on. And much of Eastern Europe is behind the Iron Curtain, as it is called, and most of the Eastern European countries are then satellite nations under the control of the Soviet Union. And what happens in 1956, again, the banner year that I'm pointing out here is in Hungary. There's a great deal of unrest among workers who are finding that their economic livelihood is not that good. Students who are chafing under the heel, the oppressive heel as they feel from the Soviet Union and the domestic Communist Party. There's a certain amount of demonstration and unrest, and the response on the part of the Soviet Union was quite harshly militaristic, to go in, to send in the troops, to send in the tanks, to kill various people on the street, to round up leaders, to take them in for questioning and torture and outright killing. And the point is that a significant amount of this then is captured on television, broadcast for Western audiences, and this then seems to be a blow, right, for the claims that socialism in practice is going to be a much more humane system compared to capitalism in practice. We don't find in the capitalist nations any degree of brutality on that scale being directed against, right, its own people. So what we have then is a question is, why is socialism also then not working out the way the Marxist model predicted? Marxism argued that capitalism would be exploitative, that it would be ruthlessly devastating to the poorer class, that then it would develop a certain population demographics, and it seems that capitalism is going in the exact opposite direction. The poor are not getting poorer, and the rich are getting richer, but also the middle class is getting richer, and the poor is getting richer. And while there are problems in the capitalist nations, nonetheless it seems to be progressing, right, as opposed to regressing, as Marxism would say. Socialism, on the other hand, according to classical Marxism, is to be a humane system that cares about its people, that delivers the goods and does so better than capitalism. But when we actually look at the practice in the Marxist-inspired nations, what we find is economic deprivation and brutal crushings of people's basic human rights in those nations as well. So the point then is that we now, by the time we get to 1950 or so, are about a century after the Communist Manifesto. So we have a century of actual empirical social science evidence to go on, and that evidence is adding up to a fairly devastating blow to Marxism and those who are believers in the Marxist project by the time we get to the 1950s.